So it's my pleasure to have John G.P. Warner, who is currently the co-chief of the MGA Shoulder Service and founder of Boston Shoulder Institute. He's vice chair for quality and safety for MGH orthopedics and professor of orthopedic surgery at Harvard Medical School. He's used to a past president of the American Shoulder and Elbow Society, New England Shoulder and Elbow Society, and he's a very important name of shoulder surgery in the world. I spent some months with JP in 1997, and it was a great time in Pittsburgh. And he was one of my great mentors. I do respect him very much. And it's a great pleasure to have you here, GP. It's very important for us in our MBA. It's the first year of our MBA here. And please have your time here. And we appreciate your lecture. Thanks so much to be here. We are very proud.
My pleasure. Do you want me to share my slides now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Can you all see that now?
Yes.
Okay, let me make sure I got, okay. Let me just put this on. There we go. Okay. Perfect. So thank you very much. I'm happy to chat with you a bit. The assignment I was given was very broad, so I'm going to jump around a bit. Very little on shoulder, a lot on value, a lot on innovation and entrepreneurism from a perspective, my perspective as a physician. So to start with, this is a picture taken by one of my classmates at Harvard Business School some years ago, and it just so happened that Harvard Business Review had this journal sitting in our living group area, and you can see this is about innovation. There are so many articles on innovation, but so I thought, well, why not consider orthopedics, and in particular shoulder care, but orthopedics overall from the standpoint of innovating value. There are unique barriers to our ability to actually innovate in healthcare that are quite different than for-profit entities, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, let's see. So this is borrowed from a talk I gave previously, using the title created by Clayton Christensen, a former professor at Harvard Business School, and it's entitled, Who Has the DNA to Innovate? Now, in the blue, you see here what you get if you go to the Mass General Brigham website. It says, innovation happens here. It's one thing to market that. It's another thing to actually do it. And at least as orthopedic surgeons and surgeons in general, we should think about, where does innovation really happen? These are my disclosures. I really won't talk about anything specific except a few things that I've done that have been largely not-for-profit. These are the different countries in which I have investments and advise and work on. My areas that I'm going to talk about here are going to be the Codman Shoulder Society, the Boston Shoulder Institute, which are entities I created that are not-for-profit. And I'll talk a little bit about IMISCAP, which is, you all may know as Blueprint. And a few other things, ViewMedi as well, which I helped create as well. Well, when you look for innovation, you can look all over the world, and many of these faces will be familiar to those of you who are shoulder surgeons. I added a few from Brazil since I'm talking to Brazilians today, but this was from a meeting I went to in Rome that was global and had all these people come because they were identified as surgeon innovators. Now, let's consider the last 100 years. It was actually Codman. I hope you guys know who E.A. Codman was. He was the father of value-based healthcare. He called it the end result idea, and he published a book on hospital efficiency and, of course, the shoulder, which was his book. And my mentor, subsequently, more than 100 years later, was Michael Porter, who was at Harvard Business School and has since retired. And those of you who are interested may have had the opportunity to read his classic book, Redefining Healthcare. I'll talk about a bit of their values and some others as well to give context. Now, this is where I worked after I left Pittsburgh. That's the corner office there overlooking the Charles River on the 3rd floor of the Yawkey building, which is where I worked. And while I was there, I went to Harvard Business School, founded New England Shoulder Elbow Society, the Codman Shoulder Society, and the Boston Shoulder Institute. I'm currently vice chair for quality and safety as well. 3 years ago, I asked Dr. Ellison to come and take my role at the Mass General, and actually he took my office and redecorated it and also took my OR time. And I moved out here, which is 12 miles west of the city, about 10 minutes from my house, at our newly established outpatient surgery center, where I do mostly all of my surgeries now. And a lot of the economic studies that we've done come from my practice in an outpatient center. So let's start a little bit with some names you may have heard. Clayton Christensen was an icon at Harvard Business School. He passed away. He was not my professor, but I've read significantly on the things he's innovated in terms of business and healthcare. This is an article in Harvard Business Review he wrote entitled, "When Will Disruptive Innovations Cure Healthcare?" And we're still waiting for this one. Regina Herzlinger was my professor, and I'll show you a little bit the class I went to with her. She is in the finance and accounting division, and is well known as they call her the not the father, but the grandmother of healthcare. And she wrote Why Innovations in Healthcare Are So Hard. And she wrote this book entitled Who Killed Healthcare, which is not only about the United States system, but others in the world. And then Michael Porter and Robert Kaplan partnered together to blend strategy and finance, and particularly apply it to healthcare. I still work with Robert Kaplan. Michael Porter has retired. This is from the Harvard Business Review blog network. It says the happiest people pursue the most difficult problems. So if any of you are interested in innovating in healthcare, know that you have a difficult problem ahead of you. So in 2012, I decided to redefine my comfort zone, and I took my first executive program at Harvard Business School, which was a value-based healthcare delivery seminar. And Michael Porter's right in front of me. I'm right there with physicians from all over the world attending that. And I can tell you that's a fantastic experience. Then in 2015, I went to Harvard Business School for their program on business innovations. And most of the people around me are venture capitalists. This was Regina Herzlinger's program. Here I am here in 2015. And then at Michael Porter's advice, I decided I wanted to do an executive MBA. And he suggested this program, which is Harvard Business School's one of their versions of that. 55% of my class that you see here were international. And we learned a lot more than just healthcare. We learned about fintech, we learned about retail, we learned about all sorts of different sectors of business, since I wanted to understand what I could apply from these sectors to healthcare. So let's get some context here. If you look at the public and private per capita health expense per country in 2022, you'll see the United States leads the top. Blue is public and black is private. And at the very bottom, I did my best to try to find information on Brazil. You can see it's about 10% of what it is in the United States, and your GDP, where that was, at least according to the internet. If we look at the United States, and it's even more so now, in 2014, the US spent almost 18% of its GDP on healthcare. That was more than any other country, 44% more than Sweden, which at the time was the second largest expense for healthcare. Question is, who produces more value? If you look at the US tax dollar, and this is probably going to change in the future depending on how the elections go, you can see that Medicare, Medicaid, and other healthcare lead the list in terms of the amount of spending, more even than national defense. I think with what's happening in Ukraine and other parts of the country, of the world, we're going to see defense budgets go up and healthcare budgets go down. Now, what about orthopedics? This is an industry report on orthopedics from a 30,000-foot view. And one of the things you might be interested to see is, what is the entire business of orthopedics in the world in 2023? And you can see here that it's a little over $57 billion with an annual growth rate of about 3.5%. That's kind of important to understand because it's disproportionate in the world, which countries spend more and which get more value out of it. If you look at some of the things that we consider as orthopedists, you can see the joint replacement is number one here, and the others fall way down below. Enabling technology, which is digital, is relatively little expense, and extremities, about $2.7 billion at this point. 2.1% are orthobiologics, for example. So enabling technologies, you can see here, robotics, navigation, etc. It's not yet clear to what degree these are returning real value to the system. We'll talk about that a bit. What's really interesting, however, is you look at this graph for a moment. From 1970 to 2009, this is the growth in percent of physicians and physician administrators. Now, if you look at the percent growth of US healthcare spending per capita, it exactly corresponds to the number of administrators being hired. And you can see physicians are relatively flat in the income that they are earning, the growth of their income. Why is this? It's because Obamacare and subsequent regulatory have resulted in enormous mergers that require large SG&A for these institutions to function. And I'll give you some more input on that shortly. These are multi-billion-dollar entities with very, very low margins. The income growth, as you see here, is again disproportionate. If you look at physicians in green versus administrators, you can see what's happening. This is a very hierarchical kind of system. And I wouldn't say healthcare is in danger of socializing. It's more in danger of corporatizing. Now, if you look at us as surgeons, this is the Medicare payment for hip replacement. If you look from 97 to 2005, the cost of the implant as a percentage of revenue has dramatically gone up, meaning the margins have shrunk dramatically. And you can look at this for hip replacement, for shoulder replacement, et cetera. Don't have time to go over all that, but you can see the trend. In this context, to what degree do physicians trust to what degree do patients trust their physicians? So if you look at this by country, Switzerland is number one. I don't see Brazil here, and maybe I missed it. Maybe it just didn't have a large enough number to be included, but here is United States. With all the money we spend, we're 24th on this list. That's a concern. We have to ask, why is that, and who are we creating value for? So I was very interested when I was at Harvard Business School to look at some of the economics, and this is a 1-month snapshot of all the surgery done at the Mass General Hospital. And you can see here, outpatient orthopedic surgery here and inpatient here, that's 26% of the overall volume of surgery that month. So orthopedics is in the top 3 as a revenue generator for our institution. What's fascinating is if you look at evidence-based medicine, this was an article published in 2003 in New England Journal of Medicine, and you can see the percent of the time that care delivered to patients is very low, not based on evidence. 45% of the time, we're not doing best practices. And probably the best here is coronary artery disease, but orthopedics didn't even make the list, let alone shoulder surgery. Most of our data is very weak. Again, I'll touch on this next. So Mo Bandari, you may all know, is an expert in evidence-based medicine. He wrote this book. He pointed out the hierarchy of evidence. And if you look at level 1 down to level 5, most of you wouldn't be surprised to see that most of the evidence that we base our decisions on are level 4 retrospective case studies that are small and underpowered. And we rarely have randomized studies. And even when we do, there's significant bias here. And it was Ioannidis, who is, I think, a professor at Stanford, who wrote about healthcare and evidence-based medicine in this article entitled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." That should confuse you even more, because what's the strength of our decision-making? So let's get to value before I go into innovation or anything else. So if we focus on value, I'm pretty sure all of you understand that this is outcome divided by cost. But let's consider who is the recipient of the value. Well, the patient wants an outcome. The government wants control. The insurers in the hospital, they want control, reduce costs, and they want managed time and resources. The surgeon wants an outcome. It also wants an income. When you look at all of this, this is the Chinese fortune here. It says that wasn't chicken. And in reality, I was a recipient, as in 1984, after I had an instability operation performed by one of Dr. Neer's disciples, I was put in a half-body spica cast, as you see here. Most of you wouldn't think that was value, and in retrospect, I don't either. So if we consider this definition, then we also have to put it in context of Herzlinger and Porter, which is basically outcome is defined by the patient minus complications, and then the cost of the surgery. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about cost till the end of this, because cost analysis is rather boring. But I can just tell you that it depends on what you measure. It depends on the accounting methodology you use. And most of the hospital systems that I know of don't know how to measure the value of your time. And that's an important concept. As surgeons, we want to be efficient. So if we look at the different stakeholders here, what does industry want? What do surgeons want? What do patients want, or what do they need? And this is a short list here. Shorter learning curve, so we have less complications from people who are just learning how to do an operation. Reduced errors in planning, avoiding the wrong surgery and the wrong plan. Reduced errors in surgical execution. How do we engineer error avoidance, which is what NASA does and others do all the time. Airline industry does it. We don't do it well. Improved constructs for better biomechanics and better durability. I'll touch on that. Improved patient experience and lower cost. That's a fair list. Now, think about this for a minute. Value is time dependent. So on the bottom is time, and on the vertical is the subjective value or the recovery perceived by the patient. And this is primary total shoulder, primary reverse, and primary revision. And you can see that they're close to one another in terms of trajectory of recovery. However, revision is much slower. What's interesting in the United States is that there's a 3-month global payment period. So after 3 months, the surgeon and the hospital are off the hook. All the rest of the value we create is captured by the patient. Now, if we start using products that are more expensive, but we think they're better to give the patient a better outcome, we will compromise our own margins in our institution. This becomes an ethical and financial question that most surgeons have no idea what things cost, and they assume that their patients do well even though they don't follow them enough. So let me zoom out for a minute and just give you this list I got from the internet of the 12 greatest innovators of all time if we talk about innovation. And Thomas Edison led the list with the light bulb. We can talk about these, but there are some you may not recognize. For example, Marie Curie, radioactivity, the first woman awarded the Nobel twice. Okay, the Wright brothers, Richard Feynman, quantum theory. You don't see much here about healthcare, do you? Except for perhaps Marie Curie. And the top medical advances in history, you can see here, start with vaccines that actually began in the 1700s. And they're starting to come to orthopedics now as we talk about artificial intelligence, but that's a whole nother lecture. And we're very slow to the game in orthopedics with using artificial intelligence. So back to Clayton Christensen. He's tried to identify individuals who have the potential to innovate and look at their behavior. And these are just some people you'll know. It was Steve Jobs who said, I want to put a ding in the universe. It was Jeff Bezos who said, you have to be willing to be misunderstood if you're going to innovate. And it's Elon Musk who said, it's possible for ordinary people to choose to be extraordinary. I'm not exactly sure why he says that, because he's not in any way ordinary. Clayton Christensen and his colleagues did a study. They realized that it's not a genetic trait, but a modifiable behavior if you want to be an innovator. In fact, nurture trumps nature. You're not born with a skill. Creative impact depends on 5 key behaviors. Questioning. How much are we willing to break the status quo? Think about that. Most of us are work in environments where the status quo remains because of the inertia to keep it that way. That's risk averse. Observing. Do we really spend time to look to see what we can change? Or are we so busy looking after our day-to-day things? Networking. Do we create sufficient connections that we have a broader network of individuals to help advise us and work with us on the best innovations? Experimenting. Well, as surgeons, do we experiment? We'll talk about that in a little bit. And the most important is actually associational thinking. And that's by linking ideas together that are not directly related. And this data, their methodology, comes from 2,500 innovators and 15,000 executives in 75 countries. I think it fulfills the criteria for a reasonable number. So if we talk about triggered associational thinking, it requires questioning, observing, networking, experimenting. If you want to create a new business, new products, new services, or new processes, I can tell you that my institution and many other academic medical centers are contrary to this mindset. And I'll share some data with you about this. Thomas Crummell is a gentleman I never met. He was the director of the Surgical Innovation Program at Stanford. These are some quotes he made that may resonate with those of you who are surgeons who seek to be innovators. He said, a scientist seeks understanding, an inventor seeks a solution, and an innovator seeks an application. Very important, because nothing scales unless it creates a profit. For that, it has to have an application. An entrepreneur seeks independence, autonomy, and control to maximize the likelihood of success in a risky, but defined, and uncertain, ill-defined venture. That sounds a lot like a surgeon. As well, surgeons who ignore technological advancements do so at their own peril. And you have some really innovative people in Brazil. I won't name names, I don't want to embarrass them, but innovation comes from all over the world. Are we broad enough in our view to look more than just what we see at home? Regina Hersinger created this framework for innovating in healthcare that I share with you. And if you're interested in these ideas or others, At the end, I'll share with you the Codman Shoulder Society that you can go to. Everyone's welcome to be a member. It's free, and I'll explain what you get for that opportunity. But Regina basically said to be successful in innovation, it has to be profitable, it has to reduce costs, and it has to have advocates. Okay, it can be technological, it can be an integration of things, or it can be a consumer-based. There are these 6 factors that affect whether an innovation survives: the structure, who's against you and who's for you, who will block your way; public policy, what's the local, national, institutional rules and climate in terms of bringing something to the market; who's paying for this? That's financing. Technology, well, we have lots of technology now. Are we using it effectively and even measuring its impact? Consumers, these are the patients, the insurers, and the government. You know, one is receiving the care, others are paying for it. That's a bizarre sort of business model. And is there alignment and transparency? So Clayton Christensen talked about disruptive innovations, things like low intensity portable X-ray machines, costing about 10% of larger machines, physician-owned hospitals, which are now illegal in the United States, cheaper, simpler, effective alternatives. All of these have been blocked. Academic medical centers tend to promote expensive technology, and they can't run efficient and lean businesses. I'll show you some examples of this. And outpatient surgery centers and specialty care facilities are more cost effective. So the deck is already stacked against us in the United States if we try to innovate by creating some of these things. And this is really important. If you look here on complexity and diagnosis of treatment and time, you know, Christensen pointed out that instead of working to enable the natural upmarket migration that is intrinsic part of economic progress, today's managed care organizations and insurers and regulators have done just the opposite. We trained for years to become physicians, highly trained, and we're forced down market to do simple things like clerical coding, simple diagnosis, things that should not be given to us that don't take advantage of our skill set. Why? Because that's the way regulatory is going, at least in this country. Academic medical centers say we should be paid more because we have higher average costs. And this is an old slide from 1998. But a lot of these costs are because of the way they do business. They are incapable of running lean management, and they want to be too many things to too many people. Especially hospitals are actually a very, very logical thing. So where you work potentially affects your ability to deliver value in that context. Even hospital budget systems are a problem. This is an article by Derek Haas and Robert Kaplan, 2 individuals I've worked with before. They looked at 800 digital health startups were funded in 2017. 75% of senior hospital executives endorsed digital innovation. Hospitals have been notoriously slow at adopting digital innovation. So even though hospitals want innovation, they tend to be a barrier to it. Why? Because each segment of the hospital has a separate budget. There are rigid annual budgeting reporting duties, and it's very difficult to combine budgets to do something that integrates anything, which I told you was one of the most important elements of innovation. These are real financial barriers. Einstein asked, where does innovation come from? So imagination, he said, is more important than knowledge. The question is, at the end of the day, after we're doing all of our work, how much imagination do we have left over to do the creative things? And so where does innovation come in the context of all this noise? And what I'm going to talk a little bit about is trying to tease things away from the noise that you hear all the time. So culture, which I'll come back to, is the single most important barrier or facilitator for innovation. Most of our hospitals want us to fit like these pegs into the right shaped hole. They don't want you to be innovative. They want you to just do your job. That's okay if you're okay with that and you work in a place like that. But if you're like me, you have to do something like this. And this is always a problem for people that work in an environment that doesn't provide the culture to innovate. Always. In fact, even Codman was affected by this. This is from Codman's book, and it points out that your financial health affects your outlook and your priority. This upside down pyramid that you see here, this puts the patient at the top. That's what you do when you're doing well, when you feel freedom to innovate, when you have enough money that you don't worry about it. But at the end of his career, his ego and his needs came first because he wasn't so successful financially. So the compensation that you make has a lot to do with your freedom to be innovative. And if all you're doing over and over again is creating more value for your family by doing one thing after another thing the same way, you don't have the opportunity to be creative or really to benefit your patients. The London School of Business did this nice study in the Journal of Management entitled Soft and Hard Models of Human Resource Management. What does that have to do with hospitals? Well, the soft model are companies like Google and Netflix. They're bottom up for profit. They want to scale innovation because that's the core of who they are. Most academic medical centers are the hard model. They tell you the framework in which you can work, and they may say they want innovation, but they don't create an environment conducive to it, as I've just shown you, and we'll show you more of in a moment. In fact, one of my professors made this comment, and this is drawing, most of you probably recognize this as Escher, an artist. 1% of people are ambidextrous, meaning either hand works. But you can also say 1% of companies are ambidextrous as well. They're the ones that win, the ones I just showed you and many others. And in fact, ambidexterity in business means you have to be able to manage and innovate at the same time. Again, I think that's very difficult for us as surgeons to be in that setting. Now, Harvard Business School did an interesting study. They looked at culture and performance in weak cultures versus strong cultures without going into the details. You can see the enormous difference in revenue, in workforce expansion, in stock prices, and in income boosts. It begins and ends with the culture of where you work. And if your culture is not aligned with your desires, you either have to find another culture or just live with the reality of where you work. Now, this is an adoption curve many of you may be familiar with, and this has to do with innovation all the way through resistors and laggards. Now, if you look at different practice environments in the United States, I've doctored this to sort of put them where I think they wind up. I think private groups and private physicians are much better at innovating, at least thought innovating, than downstream. If you look at early majority, that's kind of people in private, but somewhat academic settings. The academics are the ones to the right, and large academic medical centers, many of them are laggards. They are risk averse because it's their nature, because they have to deliver care without taking a lot of risk in the process. So they don't want to experiment much, at least not for us as surgeons. This is a very, very interesting article that's worth dwelling on. This is from Health Affairs Scholar, which I'm sure most of you never read. It's entitled, Why is it so hard for academic medical centers to succeed in value-based care? Okay, let me just read this to you. Academic medical centers excel in many ways, but struggle to succeed at delivering cost-effective care in a value-based payment model. Much of that underperformance is due to lack of two core competencies. Number one, limited ability to redesign clinical workflows. Things are sort of set the way they are the larger the organization. Two, inability or unwillingness to change their economic relationships with their own specialists. This is very, very important. Are you employees or are you partners? Key factors, electronic medical records that lock in work patterns, compensation systems that reward volume over value, organizational structure that's problematic for change management, and complex and poor accounting systems, which I won't get into much here, but a lot of the accounting systems in our healthcare centers are anachronisms. They're not relevant to the way we really do business. One more bell-shaped curve. These are examples of products and services that have risen in enthusiasm and fallen with reality. Arthroscopic thermal shrinkage, you may remember that. Metal-on-metal hip replacement, Vioxx, and intra-articular pain pumps, to name a few. You might also put SCR here, but that, of course, depends on your view. So if you choose to be an entrepreneur, you better have one thing above all, and that's resilience. What do I mean by resilience? The willingness to fail and keep going after something. The change process, and I think I got this from a cartoon at Harvard Business School, can't remember. If you start with the status quo and you have an idea, you will always meet resistance. Funding will be a problem. Then you'll get ridiculed. Then you'll despair as you're running out of money. Somewhere along the line, if you're lucky, you'll get validation, and that's a small percentage. And you can integrate, get more funding, and then you survive and become profitable. That, unfortunately, is the pathway that virtually every single startup goes through. So this was from a lecture I gave, and I just thought I'd take this slide. In your career, when you think about your mistakes and what you achieve, I made many mistakes, which led to my desire to go to business school. And then my legacy is really what I'm doing now. It's not so much my resume. And in fact, one thing that's really important I've learned is the more people you take with you, the straighter the line you make in terms of success. Most of us, the reality is on the right side with what we do. Success is not a straight line. So I asked the Codman Shoulder Society, that's a group of mostly experts, to list for me the top innovations that they think have occurred, particularly in shoulder surgery. You could do this for health or orthopedics in general. It was Codman who said, give me something that's different for there's a chance of it being better. So that's an entrepreneur. Ozan Varol wrote a book entitled Think Like a Rocket Scientist. He was a NASA engineer. He pointed out when you ask these kinds of questions, you have to be aware of confirmation bias, because most of us undervalue evidence that contradicts what we believe and overvalue the evidence that confirms it. If you think about that for a minute, orthopedic surgeons are very opinionated. But one thing and by the way, we published this in Rockwood and Matson's book as this chapter. One thing we found was that reverse prosthesis was the #1 item brought up of all the different technologies. And what's fascinating to me is Christian Gerber said, these are all innovations, but what do we take for granted now? All of these things we tend to take for granted. At the time, most of these were resisted. And, when you start to take things like this for granted, you lose the ability to really look for things that you can innovate. Don't despair. I'll try to go over that a bit. Now, this chart again, you can see my hospital where I think they fall on the adoption curve. And you can see Paul Gramont here, who basically created an innovation called reverse replacement that has continued to scale. Most academic medical centers don't work that way. And in fact, when we look at innovators, you'll see what I'm talking about. This is Codman. He innovated lots of things. First anesthesia record, first book in English on the shoulder, tumor registry, first use of radiography for fractures, which is probably why he never had any children, because he probably sterilized himself from the radiation. Now, if I present this to you, I do so understanding that these are giants, and I'm just trying to recount to you their contributions, and nothing to do with what I think about. This is Charlie Neer. This is one of the things he put forth, anterior chromioplasty for chronic impingement syndrome. Unfortunately, it was wrong. That doesn't mean it didn't innovate many things, but it was wrong, as we now know that rotator cuff tears don't necessarily come usually from impingement. Most of you know John Charnley, the first modern total hip arthroplasty, William Harris, who created cross-linked polyethylene. John Charnley, functioned at a time when academic medical centers were not really barriers. And William Harris was in private practice. Most of you probably don't know that. Cross-linked polyethylene revolutionized all joint replacement and actually reduced the cost of hip arthroplasty, but it was resisted by many early on. Reinhold Gans, who you may have heard of, he invented femoroacetabular impingement concept that led to all of what we know about osteotomies and, most importantly, arthroscopic treatment of femoroacetabular impingement. By the way, when he did that, he had no grants, and he had by then almost retired as chairman at the at the Inselspital in Bern. Paul Gramont was ridiculed when he first came out with his prosthesis because many had failed before him. In fact, he had a stroke and became aphasic before his first reverse replacement was placed in the United States. Christian Gerber lent me this graph. I think it's very interesting. When you look at creating health value on the vertical, and then you look at the cost on the horizontal, improving value occurs at the steep part of the curve. Ask yourself how many things that you may look at that people try to tell you are innovation that are really derivative. Why? Because they don't really reduce cost, and they're just one redesign of something that's not that impactful. So it's very difficult to be on the steep part of the curve in terms of the innovations we see. And that includes things that I've done that I'll share with you. The technology lifestyle includes the concept of the chasm that you have to cross. Novel items are for people who are technophiles, who really want to use these things because it's about who they feel they are. You guys know about robotics and AI and other things that we've yet to see the real value possibility there. To cross the chasm, it has to become easier for people to use. It has to involve no major change process and preferably lower cost. That's a big ask. So what about surgeons who have the DNA to innovate? I've shown you some of these already, even ones that have failed. It's not just the DNA, really, it's their behavior. To what degree do they behave as innovators? Well, this is an award created by Christian Gerber to honor a guy named Dominic Meyer, who was a friend and a colleague of mine. Dominic passed away several years ago from ALS, was a really brilliant surgeon, was going to be Professor Gerber's successor. So they named an award after him, which is honoring every several years the most innovative individual in orthopedics. And the first year, the winner was Reinhold Gans. Now, if you look at what he said when he accepted this award, consider this. He said, innovation is barely possible without breaking the rules. Now, he's a generation older than me. Even he understands that. Curiosity and lateral thinking are more helpful than follow-up studies and meta-analyses, and teamwork is indispensable to get a project going. And he said, I was privileged to work with extremely motivated teams. Nobody does this alone. Do not invest in a company where the founder remains as a CEO 10 years after the company is founded. That company will likely fail. Well, if you look at the reversed idea, it went from Europe and eventually came to us, and that's how it scaled. And the story, my story with reverse is I had a lot to do with scaling it in the United States. Many others have as well. This was a young Gilles Walsh with Paul Grammont. Here's Christian Gerber and Gilles Walsh. Here's Pascal Boileau. And here's Mark Frankel, who really pushed it forward in the United States. Let's consider all these innovators who changed treatment paradigms, not derivative, but disruptive. Sir John Charnley, I already told you about, Reinhold Gans as well, Paul Grammont. But how many of you know Watanabe, who revolutionized arthroscopy? William Harris, we talked about. Christian Gerber, who revolutionized the way we think about rotator cuff tears, arthroplasty, tendon transfers. Lanny Johnson, who had multiple patents in arthroscopy. Charlie Neer, Richard Kaspari, who passed at a young age, but basically revolutionized arthroscopy. And I bet none of you know who Ray Thal was. He held the patent for the first knotless anchor, which was licensed to Mitech. He was in private practice in Virginia. Others, like Gilles Walsh and Pascal Boileau, and I think most of you would agree with Joe Ionati, who have really changed the way we think about the role of digital technology. So many more. A few others, Lanny Johnson. These are some of the things he invented, including the motorized shaver, first attempts at arthroscopic repair. Steve Snyder, who continues to innovate to this day, and Laurent Lafosse, who is a brilliant surgeon who taught us about suprascapular nerve and arthroscopic Latarjet, etc. So Paul Grammont had a lot of failures. These were his original designs. One of these involved the humerus screwing together in a clockwise fashion, and I think as the patient used the arm, it unscrewed and dissociated, just to share with you one of his failures. Now, why I share all these things with you, because the strength of your skills and your integrity and your innovation comes from the people who you become friends with. It becomes from the network you build. And building a network isn't about the number of people you meet, but the number you introduce others to. It's as powerful as compounding interest in an investment in the bank. So look at these young innovators who grew up together, who helped one another innovate. Goutalier, Daniel Mollet, Gilles Walsh, Pascal Boileau, Christian Gerber, others. They went after the 6th Congress of the International Congress of Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons to Helsinki for a retreat together, met in 1995 and remained friends and collaborators and competitors since. This is a little bit my story. In 2007, you can see some faces here: Christian Gerber, Evan Flato, a young Buddy Savoy, myself, and Bassem El-Hassan when he was a young man before he had the ponytail. These are all the meetings that I attended, not to teach people, but to learn from them. Innovative people are willing to travel and learn from new experiences. Beware the surgeon that tells you, I've done this for years and it works perfectly. They're more dealing with their own ego than the opportunity to be open-minded to innovate. Now, coming back to organizations, if you look at the Mass General Brigham and you look at a smaller organization, these are not my ideas. These are from Christensen and others. Large organizations create a top-down management team selected for their delivery skills, not their disruptive skills. Establishing firms to do well with incremental innovations. This is why in surgery we tend to do incremental innovations, not earth-shattering, major innovations. If you look at a smaller organization, in this case I show you a Stedman Clinic, or maybe HSS, which is a specialty hospital, leaders are selected based on their ability to disrupt, how to think differently. Smaller firms tend to do better with radical changes than larger firms. Now, Michael Porter said the essence of strategy is choosing what not to do. To do that, you have to know where you work, and you have to know where you feel you're most comfortable. What will you do and what won't you do? So let me explain a little bit of the way I've thought about this in the context of my own organization and outside of it. My roadmap is basically differentiation. That differentiation is the same thing a company goes through, be it a startup or a Google. How do you differentiate what you offer that's different than others? And I started this website, which is Boston Shoulder Institute, in 2014. I decided I would make it about the patient, not about me, and clearly state the value proposition based on these 5 items: communication, access, accountability, transparency, care coordination, and critical introspection. So how do I do that? So what do consumers want? Well, the first thing is they want confidence. Next, they want reassurance. For this, you have to measure. I wonder how many of you systematically measure everything you do, let alone report it. When I looked at the top 30 U.S. News and World Ranked programs, which we published on this, only 27% presented anything on outcomes that matter to patients on their website. So if you look at quality measures, you can see here our reporting. Every year we update this, including analysis of how fast patients recover, including outcomes reporting. Every year we publish, and you can go to the Boston Shoulder Institute. Every year we publish everything we do, and we publish our complications that year. In fact, here's a typical report for 2023 about what I did that year, which kind of categories they fell into. Here's a breakdown of the complications. Here we had 7 nerve problems, which is interesting. I can tell you that that led to me looking at 933 shoulder replacements and realizing that only 3 patients had a lasting problem. All of these others recovered. But this is useful because patients can look at this and get the confidence and reassurance they want. We look at each complication type. We look at whether they get better and whether they don't get better. If you look here, for example, we do cohort analyses. From this, we can look at how satisfied patients are. Sorry to go through it quickly, but you can go to the website if you want. We can look at why are people unhappy? What problems did they have? We could look at their experience. One thing that's really interesting is if you ask patients a minimum of 1 year after their shoulder replacement, 55% will tell you that it's exceeded their expectations because they didn't realize how fast they get better and how happy they'd be. If you look in other cohort analyses, here's one on reverse replacement, 127 patients over a 3-year period, primary reverse. And again, complications. From this, we did cohort analysis. We have a larger number now, but we have a 0.25% infection rate, which is significantly lower than the norm. And we actually wrote an article, Dr. Higgins and I, with the help of Michael Porter, which was an editorial looking at Codman versus Porter and analyzing an article that came out previously on who provides the best care. I'll share some of that data with you. Now, this is an important quote from Bob Kaplan. Bob Kaplan is an accountant, and he says, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And if you can't manage it, you can't improve it. So this virtuous circle of value is created by Michael Porter. And the bottom line is your strategy should be that you become an expert to provide better care to benefit your patients. If you do this, everything will come positive for you. And if you follow this around, more experience, more patients, better revenue, faster innovation, etc. This gives you a competitive advantage, improved outcomes, and potentially reduced costs if you work in the right place. Now, Codman measured outcomes 100 years ago. These are his end result cards. There were no computers. And our Codman Shoulder Society honors his lifetime for this work. He was the first person to actually measure outcome and cost and show value. What you see here is the cost of a rotator cuff repair when the patient fails the surgery or when the surgery succeeds. It's about 3 times higher, 4 times higher actually, if the operation fails. We need to measure the denominator, very difficult to do in addition to the numerator, if we want to understand the implications of what we do. So Codman also said, that he wanted to innovate. And the group that we established in 2014 is, quote, committed to the end result for every patient to determine best practices and optimize outcomes in shoulder surgery, just like Codman envisioned. So let me share a few things with you here. Here we go. If you go to our website, every one of our annual meetings is recorded and on ViewMedi and scribed there. So in let's see, what year was this? I don't even remember. In this meeting here, Christian Gerber and Jill Walsh talked about innovation and getting better. We had other speakers as well. In this meeting here, Bob Kaplan talked about how to measure outcomes in healthcare as our visiting professor. And we have many more. For those who are interested, I have a blog there. These are all the things that are relevant to you, the things I've been talking about, including business things, but also including how you manage your life in the context of the business you may want to do. It's all available to you if you wish. This is our group in 2019. This is a group photo when Bob Kaplan came to us. This is our group in 2022, where we talked about digital technology and its application in shoulder care. Here's 2023, when we looked at leadership and career development and behaviors in terms of entrepreneurs and innovation. And last year, we did a webinar entitled Value of Orthopedic Surgery, and it was all about physician relationships with their hospitals in terms of economics. Our keynote speaker was Professor Susanna Galani from Harvard Business School, who presented on how to think about physician-hospital alignment and alternate compensation plans. Okay. I also created the value-based healthcare research group with an organization named Avant-Garde Healthcare that is an outgrowth of the Harvard Business School. This is a group that looks at the cost of care and does so in an automated fashion. They're quite a remarkable group. One of their people actually has spent some time in Brazil working there. I'm happy to share details if you're interested, but they're a fantastic group. So here's one of our articles that we published, and we published, I don't know, maybe 20, 25 now. You can see all the people that are part of our group. If you want to be part of this, all you got to do is ask. This study was on surgeon volume as associated with the risk of revision surgery in shoulder arthroplasty. Now, I want to point out to you, we looked at Medicare databases. We looked at 151,000 arthroplasty cases of anatomical and reverse replacement. That is a significant power. What we found is an interesting analysis that about 50% of surgeons are low volume surgeons in the United States. This means that they have not worked through their learning curve. And the high volume surgeons, fortunately, account for 38%, which means they're more skilled and likely to have less complications. Okay. What's interesting is if you look at the actual revision rate according to the volume of the surgeon, there's an undeniable trend. And frankly, and you look here, this for revision, anatomical and reverse. Frankly, there's a scatter plot that looks like this. And if you look at the decreased odds risk of revision over 2 years, surgeons that do reverse more than 29 cases had a 26% reduction in their risk. In the case of anatomical, it was a 33% reduction. So patients need to look for surgeons that are skilled through volume if they can't even measure their outcome. Here's another one just recently published looking at machine learning. Again, a very large analysis and our conclusions. So as a group, I've chosen to scale with my colleagues. Remember I said build a network? Here's my network. Now, a few specific products, and I'm getting towards the end of my talk. I was involved in a company named Imiscap, which you now may know as Blueprint. This was bought by Wright Medical. It was a collaboration of Gilles Valche, Pascal Bourleau, myself, and Jean Chouy, and then other investors to create the first automated digital planning tool. You may or may not think this provides value, but it gives you the opportunity to make your errors virtually rather than in the patient. And since this came out, many other companies have their versions. Mixed reality has been the next step here. Whether or not that makes a difference is hard to say for sure. Tenet Medical, they created the Spider. I helped create that we created and sold to Smith & Nephew years ago. Orthospace, you may be aware of. I don't know if it's available in Brazil, but it's a artificial bursa that can be used when patients have massive rotator cuff tears without arthritis, instead of doing something else like a reverse replacement or SCR. And then, of course, most of you will know ViewMedi, and I was one of the early ones in ViewMedi, and I'm still on their board. So who creates value and who captures it? The reality is what I've been talking about is a complicated tug of war. At least it feels that way. If I'm the doctor, then the patient's pulling close to where I am. Maybe not exactly. The hospital often pulls in a different direction, the government in a different one, and then insurance companies and implant companies, entirely different direction. To get to the end, if you want to innovate, you have to navigate these forces that are contrary to one another. So, context. Do you work in an environment where the carrot is rewarded or the stick? And the concept being, are you penalized for trying or are you rewarded for trying? It was the famous management guru, Peter Drucker, who said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But I bet most of you didn't know who said this. You're either at the table or on the menu. That actually was the gangster Al Capone, who was in Chicago many years ago. So what's the definition of value? I'm going to close out with a little bit of cost analysis. You have to consider these different factors. We tended to do time-determined activity-based costing, which works well in our outpatient center because of their accounting methodology, but not in the main hospital. And so here's an article we recently published that I presented at our annual meeting this year for the Codman Shoulder Society, we looked at surgeon-related drivers of hospital costs. And we did so as a rationale for gain sharing, where we could create value for the hospital by managing costs and thus reducing the overall cost of care and improving on the margin. What my colleague here, Evan O'Donnell, found out was that arthroscopic rotator cuff repair is performed by 13 surgeons, of which that include 13 shoulder surgeons and sports surgeons at our 2 academic medical centers, varied from the least expensive to the most expensive by a factor of 6x. The intraoperative costs counted for 91% of the day of surgery, and the major cost drivers were biological adjuncts and the surgeon preference for what he used. That preference had nothing to do with many other factors like the age of the patient, comorbidities, and number of tendons torn. In fact, it was an idiosyncratic preference that was basically agnostic when it came to cost. Additional drivers, but less important, were tendon retraction, fatty atrophy, and the number of anchors used. This is a way of representing this. If you look at what's in the white, that's the normalized cost per patient. And what's in the red are the higher cost patients. Those guys are probably losing money for the hospital. If we were to be able to bring everything inside the white, we would create enormous value for our hospital. I'm only talking about shoulder. You can do this in everything. Now, why is this important? This is from my own hospital analysis I did when I went to Harvard Business School. If you look at patient cash flow and you look at operating expenses of an orthopedic department, they usually look like this. Most academic programs are margin negative, and funds flow from the hospital is imperative to keep them solvent. Now, if we look at larger health systems in the United States, this is a busy slide, but each one on the left is a different healthcare system. At the top is Tenet Healthcare. I'll get to that in a minute. So the Mass General Brigham in 2022 made $16.7 billion and had a minus 1.7% operating margin. In 2023, it improved a bit. They made $18.8 billion and had a 0.5% positive margin. Now, if you look here at 2023 into 2024, that margin dropped to 0.1%. And as only recently, looks like it's going to come out at 0.3%. Why is that relevant? Well, Tenet Healthcare is not an academic medical center. Their revenue is $21 billion with a margin, an operating margin of 14.6%. So there's a burden if you want to be in a teaching facility. Kaiser Permanente, also not so much, recently started the medical school, but $100 billion in revenue with an operating margin of 3.4%. That's not very good when you consider the world at large. Now, I also looked at ACL surgery, and if you look at the different surgeons doing this, surgeon A, B, C, et cetera, and you look at their volume, and then you look at their average cost per case, the variation from least to most expensive, least being in green and most being in yellow, is 2.3 times. Why is it that for a simple operation, there's such a multiple? And when we repeated this, the study that Evan O'Donnell did, it actually came out even higher when I looked at our group of shoulder surgeons just in our outpatient center where I work now. It's almost 8 times more expensive. So it was Einstein who said genius abhors consensus, because when consensus is reached, thinking stop nodding your head. This is what I see in most of the meetings in my academic medical center, people nodding the head up and down, not sideways. Now, I want to leave you with this last slide. For those who are interested, go to the Boston Shoulder Institute or Codman Shoulder Society and take a look. My email is up here, both my professional and my private one. If you want to take a photo of the screen, please do so. And feel free to write to me. If anybody wants to belong to the Codman Shoulder Society, you have access to what I post there and our meetings and participation if you want. The last thing I want to invite you to is the 42nd annual shoulder course for the San Diego Shoulder Institute. I'm now the president. Jim Esch, who founded this, asked me to take over. No shoulder program that I know of in the world is 42 years old. And next year, this is the date of our meeting, and it's going to be in San Diego at the Del Coronado. So that's it. Thanks, everybody, for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. And I hope I didn't put anyone to sleep. Okay.
Thank you so much, EP. It's a really amazing experience. You're very happy. We are very happy. And I want to know if someone wants to ask a question. Please, you can open your audio and ask the question.
Everybody's either asleep or scared to death.
You
Anybody?
know, for those don't know yet, GP is one of the great shoulder enable surgery of all time. JP, it's a great, uh, it's a great lecture. You are goat shoulder surgery. What's our opinion now in the United States about the robotic surgeries? What's the way of the robotic
Yeah.
surgeries?
So I can only tell you what I've read because I don't use the robot. I work with Stryker now, who bought my company, Imascap. Actually bought Wright Medical, which owned Imascap. And so Stryker has two approaches: mixed reality referencing and navigation, or robotics. If I understand correctly, the Mako robot is the only, I have no conflict here, is the only robot that has haptic boundaries. Everything else is more navigation. So why is that useful? The economics of robotics is basically, it democratizes outcomes. It helps less experienced surgeons avoid the errors they might otherwise make because they've navigated or have boundaries in what they're doing. It is generally not that helpful for experts who already know how to do it well. And the argument you will hear largely is that I'm an expert, I don't need this. And that may well be the case. But 50% at least of people doing shoulder surgery need a robot to watch over them, that they don't make a mess out of what they're doing. Now, how is that scaling? I don't know those numbers, except to say most robots cost $1 million or so. Then you have carrying costs for management and oversight, and et cetera. That's a high CapEx, item. So I think Stryker's banking on the fact that they have, I don't know, almost 2,000 robots in the world, and they can easily be adopted to shoulder surgery. So that's about all I know about it. I don't, in my hospital, there are hip surgeons doing it. We don't have one for the shoulder yet.
Thanks.
O professor Bena, professor Andreoli, para variar, eu tenho uma pergunta, posso me dirigir aí ao
Yes,
colega?
I didn't get that.
Well, good evening, sir. First of all, I want to thank you for the lecture. It was a pleasure to watch and learn from you. And I have only two questions. Are you hear me? Do you
Yeah,
hear
I
me
hear you
well?
fine. Yep,
Okay.
go ahead.
Well, the first one is how was the impact of those public health programs in this practice or this trying to make more value? Well, we know that Medicare and the other programs in the US wasn't working quite well, especially for the doctors or for the practitioners. But how did it impact on your research on value-based healthcare? And the second one, it's how do we that like innovation challenge the establishment? How do we deal with that?
So let me give you some historical context. Codman resigned, more or less was fired from Mass General Hospital. Okay, he was a beginning innovator. You have to be crucified almost if you want to fight them, because you have to find a way around, not through. I like the analogy someone once told me. If you're a big wave, you still hit the rock on the shore, and the rock is still there. So you have to survive. And if you push too hard, you may suffer for it. My approach has been to, within the context of where I work, to be able to work within the guidelines of the institution at the institution, but do all my innovating outside the institution. Even if trying to change care, et cetera, no. I mean, frankly, we're merging now Mass General and Brigham together, and everything is top down. Restructuring the entire org chart, et cetera, et cetera. They want round pegs in round holes, square pegs in square holes. So I've certainly given up trying to innovate anything here. And that's how I stay sane. I have these other opportunities that keep me interested, because I realized sometime in my career, I didn't want to be a chairman. I wanted to be an innovator and work with people smarter than me. So, I'm not sure about the first question. You said something about Medicare. In the United States, we have different payers as it stands right now. Fee for service is mostly going to be replaced by employment models, hospitals buying doctor groups, et cetera. There are two polarities here. One polarity is private equity owning the doctors and telling them, you stay on the treadmill, I'm going to turn up the speed, run faster. Okay. or academic medical centers that view us as fungible assets. You know, find me another shoulder surgeon. We don't have individuality. I don't think we're going to become basically workers in the large centers. Where does Medicare fit in this? Some of this is because Medicare pays so poorly, the hospitals will die if they don't manage their costs, and we're part of their costs. Okay, so we are not at the table mostly. We're on the menu. I can't tell you how not to be on the menu. If our election goes the way it might go, and if, big if, somebody's able to make a single payer, being Medicare for everyone, this will bankrupt every single hospital in the United States because they're not ready for this. I don't know how that will go for the rest of us. I can't tell you anything about Brazil or context there because I don't really know your system well. I hope I answered some of your questions, or at least made you think about it.
Thank you so much. It was brilliant. You answered all the questions, and especially this. We have in Brazil a public healthcare that works well, but it's the same. We have low budgets, and we have to deal with that. So it's almost the same, but no one is broke now.
All right, good. Other questions?
So JP, nowadays in Brazil, we have a growth of the number of medical schools in Brazil. And you have every day, every year, much more doctors and people that are taking care. And you have the increasing of insurance, and every year we have less doctors that they don't just have the money from the patients. They have much more the money from the insurance. What do you think? What do you think that's a good solution for economy or for the public?
I'm not sure the question. Are you saying if you produce more doctors, costs will go down?
In Brazil, they think that you have more.
Okay. So
every time that you have more doctors, you have they earn less money, and it's good for the insurance, but not good for the doctors.
It's actually, let me answer it this way. If you look at the UK, didn't work in national health system there, and they have two systems too. That means that the people with money get better care than the people who don't have the money. If you look at the United States, there is going to be an enormous lack of doctors, specialists, and primary care doctors. There are not going to be enough specialists to do all the orthopedic surgery that needs to be done by 2030. And some of that is by design, because if you ration care, and the UK did this, that reduces cost, not providing more people to deliver the care, okay? If you had a system that was based on competition, so that Dr. A could provide value at a lower cost than Dr. B, that's different. But if you have a government system where that is not working, then the more people doing it, the more access patients have, the more surgeries will be done. The exact opposite problem of what we have in the United States, which is not enough surgeons to do all the surgery given the population. So that the economics of having more doctors trained, I think, is upside down, if I understand what you told me.
Yes, perfect. Do you have any more questions?
Yes, Beno. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Dr. Harder. Thank you for your enlightening presentation. It's amazing. I have a question about the innovation, specifically about the Gen AI and AI. Here in Brazil, Gen AI is quite a buzzword nowadays. So everybody talking about Gen AI. But my impression is the Gen AI becoming to be faster commodity more than a huge space to work if it's. I want to know your take about Gen AI as a opportunity to make a startup or a company to have a good profit on that.
So let me try to answer this in a broad context. That last year's American Shoulder Elbow Surgeon, I think it was last year, I talked about AI. I'm not an engineer. I just work with a lot of engineers. I try to understand. I read a lot. If you go on ViewMedi or go on Codman Society, with a link to ViewMedi, you'll see some of the talks. one of the things that's important to understand about AI is it's moving more than twice as fast as Moore's law, even faster than that. So if I predict something, I'm probably going to be wrong in 6 months, if not sooner. That's the first thing. The second thing is the regulatory world in which we work is not ready for AI. They have to define safety criteria to allow AI to work. And that's what the FDA is now trying to do. My own personal view is there are two types of AI as surgeons. I'm not talking about, what ChatGPT is doing. One type is predicting. Exactech put that with their Predict Plus for their, for what they create. They should be very much respected for their efforts in leading here. But their AI, in my opinion, is somewhat outside the value chain. By that, I mean, it's goodwill. It's not necessarily connected to the product. Their AI tells you, what's the likelihood that this patient will do well with a reverse versus something, total shoulder, whatever, something like that. Prediction is one of the hardest things for AI to do. It's actually, AI was applied to dating apps, for men and women to get together, failed completely, okay, because it couldn't predict the social behavior. Where AI, I think, is going to start to work, and already is if it's embedded in the value chain. So, for example, conflict of interest. In Blueprint, AI is now starting to be embedded to do two things. Number one is, this is your patient. You put in the CT scan for the 3D model, and you put in any relevant information, and it will tell you what % of the experts would do a reverse or a total shoulder. Now, that narrows the margin for error. It doesn't tell you exactly. It just says people don't always agree, but experts get closer. That's useful for you to know if you would share that with someone. The next part is, okay, you want to do an anatomical replacement, then you push an auto plan button. According to the criteria you put into the program, or if you default to the program's criteria, it will auto plan in probably 60 seconds the best configuration and sizing of components, which you can then decide if you want to use that or not. Those are taking AI and using it for simple, task-oriented steps that give you time back, that give you comfort and confidence. That's a big distance from predicting the future, which I think most of us are concerned about. And also, you probably heard that one of the things AI does, it hallucinates sometimes. So yeah, you have to be very careful what you do, because anything that AI does has to be approved by a human being, namely the surgeon. And so ask yourself what you will trust in the future. Now, that's where we're going. That said, AI is the #1 priority of every major orthopedic company. And I presented on this at the Codman meeting last year, and we'll publish on it soon. I looked at members of the European Shoulder Society and the American Shoulder Society, and what did they prioritize that they wanted in digital tools. And I looked at 6 major companies, what did they prioritize? And I looked at where there was an agreement and a disagreement. I don't know if that predicts the future, but it's clear that everybody wants AI. Yeah. The problem is AI does not have a good revenue model in orthopedics currently.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harder.
So I don't know if we have any more questions. I just want to ask you. Okay, we have our professor from the north of our country. Please.
My name is Rafael Levi, and I'm Piauiense.
It's from Piauí.
I want to invite John Warner to visit us, but my question is very, very short. I'm an orthopedic professor at the Federal University here, and do you think investing makes it reality to teach our residents in our underfunded state would be worthwhile? I watching Cochrane. This is very more objective, and
yeah. So if I understand correctly, you asked about the investment for education for mixed reality. Let me go a step beyond that. So I have a lot of conflicts here, in virtual reality and in mixed reality, etc. Actually, not long ago, one of your countrymen, Bruno Gobato, joined a number of us in the metaverse, in a virtual surgical operating room together, our avatars together. And with Bruno there and others from around the world in the country, we did virtual surgery together. We did a reverse replacement together. What did that cost? Zero. I have now been able to operate all over the world in the metaverse with surgeons in Saudi Arabia, in Ireland, in Canada, in your own country, using the tools we have in virtual reality to simulate surgery and use that as a basis for education and teaching our residents and such. And frankly, the American Shoulder Elbow Surgeons has just signed an agreement, a contract with Precision OS. I'm part of that. I'm part of the business development of that, so conflict of interest, to create curriculum in anatomy and basic surgery for shoulder surgeons in training. That is different than mixed reality. That is virtual reality. There you put on the Oculus, there you are in an immersive world, and you can practice and make errors and learn from the errors in the virtual world so that by the time you come to the real world, you can do the surgery. In fact, I did a virtual surgery with a guy named Thamer Al-Rayas at King Faisal Hospital in Saudi. I then flew there and gave grand rounds. I then went to the operating room and did the real surgery with him that we had done virtually. And his impression was this was an enormous advantage, because doing it virtually and then going in the operating room, you remember these things and you can do it on demand or you can do it with an expert with you. Virtual reality has been largely ignored by these companies. It's much easier and much less expensive than the others. And I think you'll see over time the growth of virtual reality, the same way the iPhone grew with apps, right? We have all these apps that we now use on the iPhone or on the computer. Well, as we have more and more simulations of different surgeries, be they trauma, be they shoulder surgery, knee surgery, what have you, we will have a portfolio, a library, if you will, of virtual reality surgery that students learning can go to and do on demand with feedback as they do it, or engage an expert to come into the virtual world with them and do the surgery with them. In fact, I'll make you an offer. If any one of you all are interested in doing a virtual reality session, I'm happy to do that with you. However, you will need something. You'll first of all need the Oculus headset. And, that's not expensive, the current Oculus, not like what mixed reality headset costs. And, you may need some support, which we can deliver. I would then add you again to, I've already done Brazil, but I can do it again. So give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. That, I think, is the future. That's low cost future too, depending on how these startup, there are many startup companies. There's Precision OS, there's OSO VR, there's Fundamental VR, many. Think about this. How many people here do you think would want to fly in a plane where the pilot didn't do simulated flights before they became a pilot? Okay. Let's ask patients. How many of you would want the surgeon operating on you before doing simulated surgery as part of their education? So that would be my answer.
Perfect. So JP, thank you so much for your excellent and unforgettable presentation. It was incredible, insightful, and we truly appreciate your time and knowledge that you share with us. Thank you so much. We are really happy and proud to have you here. Thanks so much, JP.
My pleasure. Obrigado.
Good.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Obrigado. Boa noite a todos. Muito obrigado aí pela presença. Aí a gente teve presença de pessoas muito ilustres aqui, grandes amigos aí, da SBRAT, da SBCJ, do Einstein, da Sociedade Brasileira de Ombro e Cotovelo. Então, a gente está muito contente aí por ter todos vocês. E aí a mensagem final da Andrioli aí, que é o nosso chefe aí do MBA. Por favor, Andrioli.
Sou subchefe, você é o chefe. Queria agradecer a presença de todos mesmo, né? José Sérgio Franco aí, Lúcio, Talmolin, que estava aí. Eu acho que essa aula dele é bem, né, empreendedora, inovadora, tudo. Eu acho que realmente você vê, né? Você olha o ano que ele começou, né, fazer Harvard Business School, lá 2012, 2014, né? Nunca é tarde para começar, né? O cara já era um cirurgião conhecido, já era um dos melhores cirurgiões do mundo e foi para a linha, criou o Blueprint, criou o VUMED, né? É isso aí. Lúcio, doutor Sérgio, obrigado aí.
A aula Andreoli foi realmente revolucionária, assim, em termos de ver que a gente pode caminhar cada vez mais aí. Eu acho que agregou bastante aí. Tenho certeza que acho que o pessoal aproveitou. Meu amigo Arnaldinho aqui, que está aqui também, José Franco, Lúcio, Sandro Reginaldo e tantos outros. Obrigado aí pela presença de todos aí. Boa noite a todos aí.
Pessoal, a gente vai voltar daqui 15 minutos, bater um papo para o pessoal que está fazendo o curso, para a gente falar sobre a parte final dos módulos aí desse semestre, tá bom? 15 minutos, nós voltamos. Boa noite a todos. Carinho. Não precisa gravar, não, ô, Hugo. Aqui nós vamos falar.